Welcome to Evilive, the live media commentary show that answers the question, is rock and roll really the devil's music? Subscribe if you're new to the channel because today we are reviewing Set the Night on Fire, Living, Dying, and Playing Guitar with the Doors. And of course, that is by Robby Krieger and Jeff Alulis? Alulis? I don't know how you say it. He's not the important one. He ghost wrote it. Robby Krieger. That's the one you're tuning into this book for. I have to say, initial impressions were, this is amaze balls. This is a great, great book. I finished it in 2 days. It was just a really, it's like a little bit over 400 pages, but it reads so fast. And some of those pages are blank or they have an image on them because it's the end of the chapter or a beginning of a chapter and stuff. So you do get some imagery in this, but that's not really why you're picking this book up. And I guess maybe that should be the first question. Why would anyone in 2022 pick up a book about the Doors who are somehow still in popular culture, but not a band that is like truly relevant still? It's a band that many of us, myself included, are deeply passionate about and love. You know, they were hugely influential to me when I was going through high school. But really, when you're thinking about an average person living their life, you know, you'll read a biography about the Doors or something if you happen to like them. I've read more than I should have about the Doors. Light My Fire, My Life with the Doors by Ray Manzarek, No One Gets Out Here Alive. No One Gets Out Alive by Jerry Hopkins and Danny Sugarman. Riders on the Storm, My Life with Jim Morrison and the Doors by John Densmore. And of course, you know, 2 of those were from other bandmates, drummer and organist, respectively. And Robby Krieger now finally decided to put out his memoir about that time. But if you're coming into this book thinking that this is going to be a play-by-play experience of how Robby was joined into the Doors band, and then, you know, after Jim Morrison died, that's sort of the end. Well, you're in for a huge upset and mistake. This is about Robby Krieger. The Doors is a huge influential part of his life, and so that's included in here too. But it also has a lot of information about just his life in general. And I didn't know how much I would really be into it because the other ones, though they do have a little bit of background biography and stuff by the other bandmates, they were okay. They were good. They had controversial bits of information that either sensationalized or downplayed moments to try to play up the myth. John Densmore is famous. I'm sorry, I don't know why I said that. Ray Manzarek is famous for bloviating stories about Jim Morrison, about his impact and his motivations and his myth especially. In fact, he wrote this really great, I think it was him anyway. I haven't double checked this. I probably should have. There's a book called Poet in Exile, which is a fictional account of what if Jim Morrison didn't die. And it was all just a cover-up. And it's a really great read. I love it because I love Jim Morrison. I love the Jim Morrison myth. But, you know, when you read this book, you get as much of an unfiltered view of not just Jim Morrison, but also the other bandmates and their versions of the story. And one can take a step back and say, well, everything is filtered through a lens. And, you know, those days were filled with drug abuse, alcohol abuse, and they were in the 60s, many, many years ago. So how accurate could the information truly be? And there's fair amount of, you know, speculation in that area. The truth is, you know, in time, your memory changes. And Robby Krieger does a wonderful job of being straight up saying, look, there were moments that were either portrayed in other, like the film or Oliver Stone's film or the other novels that I believed were true until I started writing this book, researching it, talking to other people who were there. And I realized that my memory was wrong. And then there's other parts about this book where Robby Krieger's straight up saying, look, I don't remember. I don't remember that happening at this particular event, whether it was, Miami, whether it was New Haven. There's shows where he just does not recall the minutia of detail that are either portrayed largely incorrect in the film or bloviated and put out of proportion in the different novels that have been put out about the Doors and Jim Morrison. And so when you're reading this, you're not just reading Ray Manzarek's, oh my gosh, I'm doing this again, Robby Krieger's personal account. He did his due diligence in interviewing a ton of different people. And so he's getting this collective consciousness of what actually occurred as best as can be recalled by many, many different people. This is not meant to be a sensational account. This is not meant to play into any particular myth or legend. It is just a straight up portrayal of Robby Krieger's life with the Doors and his impressions of Jim Morrison. And I have to be honest, when I first started this, I was about 100 pages, 200 pages in, I was a little upset. I have a built-up image of what Jim Morrison is and was, and it's a very much a heroic fantasy image of him. And I'm not alone. A lot of people do. We look at people who we like to emulate, and we want to sort of put them on this sort of pedestal and pretend that there's something greater than they ever actually were, or that they had intention or purpose or drives that they genuinely didn't have. And one of the things that really struck me as illuminating was that the Doors individually and collectively in interviews would intentionally misrepresent their drives and their reasons for lyrics or makeup experiences and just straight up lie to the press because they were just trying to entertain themselves. And that's sort of a running theme with this, is that Jim Morrison would regularly lie about stuff and just create reasons for lyrics that didn't really exist. And he would tell Robby Krieger, look, because they were the two biggest songwriters of the group. He would say, look, it doesn't matter what the song lyric means. The audience is going to make up a reason for that lyric. Let them do it. Don't explain your lyrics to anyone. Let them make it up, because what they come up with may be infinitely more interesting than what you had originally planned on it, and it creates this air of mystery. And so he fed into that idea of creating this air of mystery with their music, with poetry, and everything. And because of that, you will inevitably have a skewed sense of reality when reflecting back on their lives, their experiences, and their intentions, and the truth behind things. And what I really loved was that, a lot of these stories that he would tell, and this book is not a chronological book. Robby Krieger says straight up out of the gate, look, I don't think of things linearly. I jump around, and different experiences I have remind me of different thoughts and memories and experiences that I've had before, or shared experiences, and that will jump into another chapter that is completely in a different time, completely a different experience, a different people involved. And so you really are bouncing around the brain of Robby Krieger through the entire course of this novel. And I didn't think I would like it, but I really did. And the testament to that is that I burned through it in 2 days. And, for me, I usually try to pace myself and give myself time to reflect on stories and really sort of process them. And so I will intentionally break down a book. I'm going to read this in 5 days, and I'm only going to read X amount in day 1 and day 2 and day 3 and day 4. And that's so that I can process what's happening and I don't forget because I'm just trying to plow through it. This novel really forced me, because of how engaging it was. It forced me to just burn right through it because I wanted to know more. I wanted to live in the moment. And I love Robby Krieger as an individual human being infinitely more now after having read this than I ever did before. And I loved him as a musician before. And so it brings this really full, real human scope to the story. There was moments where I was literally crying reading this book, and the emotional impact that I was feeling was because, of course, shared experiences or similar experiences and the impact that those experiences have. in not only Robbie's life, but then of course the shared ones that the impact that I had in mind. It really puts things into a very interesting perspective, and it affected me. So yeah, I went way into the review here on the initial impressions bit, but I genuinely loved this novel. And to anyone who loves the Doors or is interested in music, you have to read this novel. It is brilliant, especially if you're into the Doors. But then going back to the purpose of this was written to clarify a lot of information, the truth about not only Robby Krieger's life, what his influences were, but also a lot of the mythology that was built up around the Doors themselves as a group. And later in the 90s, there was a lot of discord, we'll say nicely, between John Densmore, Ray Manzarek, and Robby Krieger. And a lot of it was because Robby Krieger and John Densmore were trying to reignite the Doors and start playing their music, and selling music to third parties to be either in rock band or in commercials and stuff. John Densmore pretended that he wanted nothing to do with it, and so he told them straight up, "Look, I don't want anything to do with the Doors anymore. I'm trying to move on. I'm trying to launch my acting career. You guys, you're the Doors. You go do your thing. I don't want anything to do with it." And then when they did, and he saw what they were making, I'm projecting on the motivations on John's part because I don't know. But when they did, John then came back, collected up the estate holders of Pam's family and Jim's family, and sued the two bandmates, saying that they were doing something that was misrepresentative of the Doors, which is ridiculous because he had literally told them to go on and they could, play as the Doors themselves, and he didn't want any part of it. But for whatever reason, at that moment, whether it was influenced by money, by greed, by fear, by jealousy, whatever the reasons, he ended up completely destroying their relationship. Ray Manzarek is very culpable in all of this because Ray would, again, bloviate and lie about the mythology, about the Doors. He would perpetuate this idea that Jim Morrison didn't actually die, and he would continue to start to believe it himself. Because again, when Jim Morrison did die, Pam had the casket sealed instantly rather than having an autopsy done in France. A lot of the rumors are because he died of a heroin overdose and she didn't want to go to jail for, being involved in heroin, even though it was a well-known thing that she was part of. And of course, no one wants their heroes to die. So if Jim Morrison is a musical hero of yours, in the same way that Elvis' survival is, people say he's alive. You just don't want to let go of something that affected and influenced you. And so I understand the motivations behind those types of people. I understand the motivation for Ray Manzarek because ultimately he was just trying to keep the Doors relevant in popular culture. And you can make a very fair argument that if he didn't do all that, the Doors might have gone the way of obscurity. But because he was constantly pushing out those lies, those myths, those legends, it kept the Doors in the collective consciousness, and it propelled them to future fans and audience lovers of their music. And so on one hand, it's terrible because he's creating up lies, and the other is that, he's actually helping the band survive and have a longevity that it might not have had otherwise. And so, for me as a fan, I actually like both sides of that coin. I don't care. I don't care how much of it is real, and I don't care how much of it is made up. And that may sound strange coming from someone who loves the Doors and would really love the historical record to be cleared on some issues. But the truth is that fiction is often more interesting than fact. And it doesn't change how I feel if I know the truth over whether I want to fantasize about the myth. It doesn't change anything, and that's okay. At least it is for me. So another part that I really loved about this book was Robbie's life, learning about his twin, the struggles that his twin had with depression, and ultimately, ended up dying, and it's not really clear whether or not he killed himself or whether it was an accident, but ultimately he did die And then him dealing with the death of his mother and drug addiction. I never knew that Robby Krieger was a drug addict, and he went from cocaine to heroin to speedballs to everything. And it wasn't just him; it was also his wife, his longtime wife. And then the impact of them just sort of going crazy through this drug addiction with their young son growing up witnessing it. And then the son, of course, goes off to have his own addiction. And, Robby doing his damnedest to sort of wrap his hands around that problem after he had cleaned himself up. And just sort of going through that, it really brought me to tears. It made me reflect on my own behaviors and my own failings as a father, and it hurt. And being honest with yourself sucks, but it is something that the only way that you can move past things and really process them is if you are honest about it. And so I found that in this novel, a lot of personal truths that I know about, and I just sort of bury because I don't want to deal with them. And this sort of put them on par where, I might have to deal with them. Addiction's a weird thing. You convince yourself that it's not a problem even when you know it is. But, he had cancer. I didn't know that. Learning about John Densmore, I'm sorry, I keep mixing up the damn names. Ray Manzarek's cancer and him dying and how that affected everything and the truth about Ray Manzarek. Because honestly, after even reading the books, like the first book I read was No One Here Gets Out Alive. And that has, again, been very sensationalized, and it's full of lies and mistruths. And, it was written by people who actually weren't around when the band was formed. And so they sort of just made up whole cloth stories, very much like Oliver Stone did. I always knew that Oliver Stone took creative license with this story. I didn't know that he completely made up stuff that did not exist at all. I just thought he took creative license with things. Combining characters and stuff like that. But no, he literally made stuff up that did not ever happen. And it makes a great film, and I still love the film, even though I know it is inaccurate, and I will always love the film, but it's not what the Doors are. And so I was saying, even after having read those novels when I was a teenager, watching the film and being influenced by it dramatically as a teenager, I think of the musicians, the Doors, as the film portrayed them. And it could just be because it's the visual stimulus rather than the reality that you find pieces of in the novels, or maybe my own memory just sort of blends all of the media together into its own version of a story like all of us do. But reading this and hearing Robby Krieger straight up go point by point on myths and legends and scenes and events and just completely tear them apart and then give the truth behind them. Like, oh no, that's not true. This is actually what happened. It actually makes me appreciate their story a lot more because yes, they projected to this fame infinitely quicker and that in a level of fame that they never found again, by the way, which I find very interesting. And they attribute it to Jim Morrison was that missing ingredient. They could never find anyone else that could really fit them all together in such a beautiful way and front the band other than Jim. And they did try. They tried for decades, and it never worked. They tried different bands and different musicians, and none of it gelled like they did. And that's another part of the story is that Robby Krieger is lamenting the fact that he couldn't get that fire back as much as he tried. He burned out at 27-ish, and then after that, he just kept trying to chase that musician high and get right back to that place where they were when Jim passed. So I just love it for all of the truth that he puts out there, all of the pain that he shares, the intimate details of his life that he candidly addresses and honestly assesses his own bad behavior throughout. This is not a glossing, shiny picture of a musician's rise to fame. This is an honest portrayal of a human being that had wonderful moments that were filled with pain and misery, but that he desperately wanted to go back and do again. Not differently, the same way. And he wanted to create new music and new experiences with the same friends that he had. Even though, we have this idea of Jim Morrison, or I have this idea of Jim Morrison, where he was brilliant, but chaotic. What's portrayed in this is that he was annoying as shit. And it was frustrating to be a bandmate with Jim Morrison because he was always screwing around. And if he was drinking, you never knew what side of him you were going to get. And it was always this sort of kid trying to show up against his father, be the most out there personality and push everyone's boundaries as much as possible, and then humbly apologize when he sobered up the next morning. That was Jim Morrison. And yes, he was brilliant. And yes, he was incredibly creative. And he was arguably the best frontman, full stop, ever of any musical band, in my opinion, and certainly in Robby's, in his portraying of his personal experience. But he was also annoying as shit. And it's just one of those things that you have to really wrap your head around, that when we idolize people, we put them on this non-human pedestal. And the truth is they are. We're all annoying. We're all frustrating. We're all filled with many different elements of what it means and collectively to be us. And usually you just sort of highlight on the stuff that the public sees or the people generally like. But this stripped everything down, and it was frustrating reading it sometimes because I wanted my hero of Jim Morrison to be better. It's frustrating to read it because I wanted their history to be different. I wanted the experiences to live up to the myths and stuff, and they don't. And they couldn't. How could they? One really important one was, the New Haven, Connecticut one where, I'm sorry, no, I think it was the Miami one where he supposedly exposed himself and they were, threw him in court until he died. But like they were never taken out by the cops that night. Yes, there was a riot. They did that all the time. But Jim Morrison backstage with the rest of the Doors and the cops were drinking beers, smoking, and laughing about what a crazy riot just went on. And then it was weeks later that a politician that was trying to push a religious right agenda, that's why they threw the court at him. And they tried to lock him up in jail. It had nothing to do with the band. It had everything to do with a politician wanting to make a name for himself. And that's the reality of history, is that we pretend it's one thing because when we reflect on it, we're reflecting on it with glasses on. These rosy colored glasses or these sort of shades that, skew reality. But that's not reality at all. And so when you look at an event in the reality of what actually occurred, it's a very, very different experience. I really appreciated seeing that truth and getting to get a glimpse into Robby Krieger's life. And I'm so incredibly glad that he's still with us and that he still shared that, at least, in 2021, when this was released on October 12th, he was, and I hope he still is, and for many years to come. It was a very even-handed novel. It didn't glorify anything. It was honest. And that's something that I really appreciated because no one else did that. In all the other novels, they all made up these glossy versions and they all lied about things and they changed and skewed things. But as far as I can tell from my reading of those and listening to anecdotal interviews and stories and articles, this is arguably the most factual account of the Doors and Robby Krieger's personal experience in life. And it's great. So I guess that's really all I had to say. What I liked best about this was the unvarnished truth. Sometimes that made me upset. Sometimes it made me bawl. Just straight up crying while I'm reading it, wiping my eyes. In crying while you have glasses sucks too, because I have to read with glasses. So, you're picking up the glasses, wiping your eyes, putting them back on, trying to find your place again, and then continuing the story. It really flew by. What I didn't like about this was the exact same reasons. I don't want to pick up a book and just bawl like a little baby for a little bit, but I did. I don't want to have my heroes torn down and made human, but it did. And as much as I didn't like it, I fucking loved it. So if you are a Doors fan, I highly recommend this novel. It is hands down, full stop, amazing. I give it 5 out of 5 evil eyes, and it probably deserves 6. This is a book that you will not be able to put down very easily. It is a book that you will burn through and you will continue to think about and process, as I'm still processing it a day after I finished it. And I really hope that you give it a chance if you're a Doors fan and you really want to know what the truth of the band actually was, and the truth of Jim Morrison, and the truth of Robby Krieger and John Densmore and Ray Manzarek. You know, it's illuminating and it's beautiful. So check it out. And that's going to do it for my review. Thank you guys so much for tuning in. As always, remember that evil spelled backwards is live. So get your asses out there and be evil.